Okay. Good evening. '15, which will finish this series out that we've kind of loosely done throughout the year, here and there. Is this one going back and forth? I don't know. We started last week with English translations part 1, covered, I mentioned I wasn't every single one of them, which would not be possible. We focused on the King James Standard version of 1901. I'm going to trade this out for the other one. Okay, something close to that, at least it'll be consistent. And we stopped with the Revised Standard, and we closed with the controversy with the Revised Standard where they technically translated something correctly, but it caused a particular drama and so forth. So that leads us to the, quote, more modern translations. And it's going to be New American Standard, New International, New King James, and the English Standard, along with maybe a little footnote to some of the others that are floating about. There's been quite a few of late that have arisen on the electronic side, and there's particular reasons for that, but we'll talk about that when we get there. So we'll start with the New American Standard Bible, and that's why it's NASB. They don't go with version. They're like one of the first versions not to use that word. The 1995 edition, its acronym is NASU, New American Standard Updated. That's why I usually put the U there. There's also a 2020 edition now. I'm not quite sure how that fits into everything. I think it's just U/2020 now. So it was originally published in 1977, been updated in 95, where there was kind of a big thing they did with the update, and I'll explain what that was in a moment. And then most recently in 2020. If you go down to Mardel, you can usually find the 95s and some of the 2020s. The 77s are really hard to come by anymore. They've kind of gone out of print. When this version was planned, Lockman Foundation was the one who backed it, funded it. The translators were to follow certain rules. Now, this is one of those ideals, right? These 4 rules. It would be true to the original languages, number 1. Number 2, it would be grammatically correct. Immediately you have a problem. Number 3, it would be understandable. Makes it even more complicated. And number 4, it would give Christ his proper place. Now, 4 isn't actually a difficult one in the sense a lot of versions, well, I get to this point, it'll be the Revised Standard, and you'll see this in some of the others, had kind of gotten out of the habit of capitalizing his or capitalizing things for deity. Whether or not that's necessary or not is a debate into itself. In terms of English rules, it had always been that way as a sign of respect toward God, but in fairness, we used to capitalize all our nouns in English anyway, much like German. So it's one of those hangovers. And it's going to be, this rule number 4 is going to cause the 1977 version to have a bit of weirdness. But like I said, the first couple rules conflict with one another. You can't actually be perfectly true to the original and still be understandable and grammatically correct in English. That sounds better. That was not good. They're going to be pulling in different directions. Typically, the first rule is going to give way to the second. It will follow a flow that is odd, not as awkward as the ASV of 1901 that we talked about last week, but it was there. So the way I'm going to look at these ones, I'm just going to give kind of strengths and weaknesses, because I'm not going to try to say, hey, you must use X. That's a silly, silly proposition. Strengths. The NASU is considered to be one of the best literal translations made to date. I saw this actually at Mardell just a couple days ago. Was it yesterday even? It was yesterday. There was one I hadn't seen before, the Legacy Standard Bible, and I went and hunted a little bit on that online. Couldn't find a whole lot of information, but given the names that are associated with the blurbs on it, probably fits more of the, quote, formal equivalence, for lack of a better term, conservative end of the spectrum. And I don't know. So there's more of the translations that are trying to be more literal that are coming out post even the ESV. And that's an example of one. So when I say one of, I'm not meaning the, okay? But the New American Standard tries to stay close to the original text. And it was able to do so in 77 because, and with its update in 95, and theoretically 2020, it utilized the best manuscripts available. Manuscript evidence, post-RSV, things were being collected. Famously, the biggest would be the Dead Sea Scrolls. Affirmed a lot of things, fixed a lot of possible variants in the Old Testament. And again, nothing salvation, level. But they were able to piece a lot of things in. It attempted to balance, and the key balance there is a heavy one. It wanted to balance being literal with a readable style, which means you're doing a seesaw all the time. That means that even sometimes entire phrases from the original text would be moved to make a better flow in English. That had been done in some other versions as well, but you'll end up actually in a couple places where if you're used to it in the King James a certain way, the order of things will have actually moved around a little bit, and it can be a little confusing. One thing the New American Standard did, which was one of the first to do so, later publishers with the older versions would include these things as their own side project, benefit, I don't know what word I'm going to go with, but when the New American Standard was published, it would include textual problems with footnotes, lots of footnotes. Footnote, this could be X. And 95% of the time, they're pretty good. They're not great in Job, but that's because Leviathan is not a alligator. But that goes to some other interpretive issues that predate the version. But it would include footnotes. And those footnotes will give, they'll highlight some thoughts, some various, I don't know the best way to put this. They give you a little more background, I guess. Things that usually are glossed over in some others. Weaknesses. I couldn't improve on the way Gordon D. Fee put this, so I just will quote him. English as it was never spoken by anyone. Now, the ASV was painful. There are certain phrasings when they tried to modernize that with the New American Standard that does come out, again, sounding like an AI that's not a human being. But it's trying to carry that literalness across. If you're looking for something that's a little more conversational, it can be difficult. A lot of charts put it at the 11th to 12th to college reading level. I always find reading levels to be a bit of a subjective thing. I don't know, different people have different levels. The 1977 version also had this problem. They changed this with the 95. They wanted to give Christ his proper due, right? Give him proper attention. Give God proper due. So you capitalize hymns and addressing deity with a capital letter. Him, he. And also names when it's assumed to be describing Christ, such as in the Old Testament, Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace. We saw that. You capitalize those as titles. Emmanuel, well, that's a dual fulfillment. We saw that. But however, for whatever reason, and I think it's partly because remember we talked about last week that churchy kind of language that you want to keep, the holdovers of ye's and these and thous, because it sounds like it's a part of everything. The New American Standard decided to get rid of that, except for in very specific cases when it didn't make a lot of sense. Whenever the speaker is addressing deity in the 77 version, and that includes when Jesus is praying to God, it'll switch to thee and thou. But it'll use you the rest of the time. So that's why you'll end up with John 17, sanctify them in the truth, thy word is truth. It was considered more respectful to address God with the these and thous. Is it? It's Middle English at best. It's in Elizabethan. It's holdover language. But it was in there. So you had a modern version that still had some of the hang-ups of that, but only at certain times. And actually, if you didn't catch why they were doing it, it would flow really strangely, where someone is using you the whole time, and then all of a sudden they start saying thee. You're like, why are you doing that? It's because they're addressing deity, addressing God. The 95 update, with several other things, got rid of that. It just said, no, we're not going to be split between this. We're just going to use you for everything. Right or wrong? You singular, you plural. That's how the late 20th century Western English is used. Very few of us actually use thous. The closest we come to a ye is y'all. So that's where we're at. So that was a weird thing. They fixed a couple elements with the 95 update because they were, again, better manuscripts. And they just basically went through and shifted things around and then stamped updated edition on it, and not everyone noticed. When I bought mine, I didn't even realize the difference until I started noticing that the teacher was using the 77, and so these were trying, well, why is this you? Oh, this is why, okay. Weaknesses, though, the New American Standard, weirdly enough, and it just comes down to the translators, it has a pretty strong premillennial bias in terms of way it phrases things that can focus on rapture theology and so forth. If you don't know what that means, don't stress over it. It's, again, not earth-shattering, but there are certain passages which are a little odd. There are some weak translations. Every version has them. It's going to come down to who did what and when. I wanted to be fair to all of them and highlight some different ones. And one that really kind of bugs me, even though it's the one I use, is in Romans 12. Romans is weaker in the New American Standard. It's Romans 12:1. And for our base, we're going to use the King James. Not that it's necessarily perfect or correct either, but it's I'm going for old versus new here. I beseech you, brethren, or therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Okay, sounds familiar? Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present yourselves a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Is there a difference there? This is a case, and you'll run into these little things, where the translator has a definite idea in his brain, or her brain, of what it's supposed to be. The problem is, of worship, the word proskuneo, which is worship, to kiss toward, isn't there. Spiritual service is the giving of self. But this is what led to this weird, popular teaching 20, 25-ish years ago that all life is worship. So the giving of yourself is worship, and it's this eternal thing. And it sounds good on paper, but when you take its conclusions to the nth degree, it gets really, really dumb. And it was formed around this notion. This is a case where, just one example, where you have a translation that's saying, hey, this is this. I have of worship crossed out in mine. Yes, I marked my Bible up because it's not in the original Greek text. Some people get really upset by that. You shouldn't look at Romans in mine then because I've made some adjustments. But, like I said, it's not perfect. Not perfect. Everyone here kind of familiar with it. I don't know how many people here use it. I do, so I hope that doesn't mess too many people up, but yeah. Okay. Any questions? Okay.
Eric, I pulled up my Bible app
Mm-hmm.
At least the NASU uses the word service. It has taken it out completely, and it just says spiritual worship.
Spiritual worship. Wow, that's okay. Yeah, yeah. Well, the ESV is going to have one really major weakness, and it's an unfortunate one because of overtime. But that we're getting to that one. I'm trying not to, I'm giving everyone equal time here. Well, okay, we should move to give everyone equal time. The New International Version, the celebrated or Bane version of the 80s, depending on how you want to look at it and where you fell in certain fights in the Brotherhood even. Popular for Pew Bibles. It was originally published in 1978. It followed the new textual background called the eclectic text. I alluded to this where the King James thread followed the more is better philosophy. The American Standard, Revised Standard, New American Standard thread followed the older is better philosophy. And people got together and said, why can't we get along and just merge them together into something everyone doesn't like, the eclectic text? And that became the basis of the New International and the New Century and the Contemporary English, a lot of the more, on that spectrum, quote, liberal versions. Again, that's a very hard to define term. Which means that the Greek behind it is fine. It's just has some of the weaknesses of one branch brought in without really the strengths of the other branch, and it just creates more confusion for people to get mad about. It was also, and this is a problem, and I'll give away, the ESV does this too, and this is problematic. And again, at least to me, it bugs me to death. It was the first translation to make the active choice not to use italics for supplied words. Now, why does that matter? If you aren't familiar or used to seeing italics in there, you won't notice what's going on. But that's an old thing. If I go back to that reference there, both of those have it. Notice the King James has it, which is. This is a very old practice. When they were trying to get a word-for-word rendering of something, okay, and you'd have to supply some English words to fill in some of the gaps of meaning because things don't always line up, especially verbiage. Usually, it doesn't matter much. But they say, okay, these are supplied words. These are words we're using to help this make sense. We're going to put them in italics so you know that these can be removed to get the more literal form. Usually they help. Usually they help. Occasionally they get in the way. For instance, when Jesus says, unless you believe that I am, and they have this converse back, and then they say, are you, basically, he's claiming to know Moses, and all things. He says, before Moses was, or, I am, and the occasionally versions will have it as, I am he. No, you don't need the he. I am is the name. It's a big deal. Most of the time they're good. However, the belief was, people are reading through the Bible, why are all these words in that funky sideways thing? Why'd they hit Control-I on all these? What's the big deal? Well, we'll just not do that. The problem is, you can't tell which words then have been supplied for translation purposes versus what are supposed to be there. You just can't see it. And that is a weakness. The biggest strength of the NIV ultimately is its selling point. What it really has, its claim to fame, its purpose for its publication was sold heavily on it is easy to read. It has no connection with the International Standard Version, which was a very vague version that was only published in a very narrow way. I actually have one that was my great-grandfather's, but it wasn't huge. The New International Version has no connection to it. They just picked the name. It was the primary selling point of the translation. When it was published in 1978, it was commonly considered to be at the 6th to 8th grade reading level. Now, that is the 6th to 8th grade reading level of 1978. I don't know if that is a factor or not. Over time, there have been subversions of it, which are meant to be even more easy to read. And they're usually used for children's Bibles. And it gets back to that question of Is that a good or a bad thing? In terms of weaknesses, well, it uses dynamic equivalence for translation. We talked about how that went from idea to idea, thought to thought, instead of word for word. So, and I'll give a couple examples of where that leads. A lot more interpretive language in the text. We're going to look at 2 verses in the NIV that are going to describe what happens when you have thought-to-thought thinking. And being easier to read can actually create more problems than good. There are certain reasons why there are terms used in the Bible that have weight to them. And when you use a simpler term, they lose a lot of that weight. There are also idioms that are employed. There's one I can think of that's pretty famous, that when the translator is trying to explain it to young people in a more direct way, it actually ends up being more adult than, there's a reason it was an idiom. And the idiom is Adam having known his wife, okay? The kids' versions, and some of them, laid out exactly what that means because, well, they're not going to understand what the idiom means. We need to make this easy to read. Well, there's a reason it's an idiom. It's just one of those things. The direct translation is the idiomatic one. Sometimes it tries to overhelp. Other versions do this. The New American Standard tries to convert all the measurements in the Revelation into English equivalents, taking these very powerful numbers that mean things, like 7,000, and then turning it into 15,000 kilometers or something like it. Anyway, being easier to read, if you don't understand what you're reading, then it's not going to be of any use to you. However, it doesn't hurt to challenge the person to want to learn too. And if it's lacking the oomph of what's there, that's where the problems can lie. When you get down to interpretive language, when you go thought per thought, you can end up with renderings such as we find in, well, Romans 10:10. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. That's the King James. The American Standard is actually pretty close to that. It's part of a broader context, which is important to bring up too. When you proof text, I mean, I'm technically proof texting here, so, but there's a broader context to Romans 10, what he's getting at, and he's explaining. That's part of sharing this, instead of just going straight to this verse or straight to 10:17 and going back to chapter 6 and everything. However, the translators had fun with this one. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you confess and are saved. In terms of context, and in terms of what Paul's getting across, it might work, but it is really strongly implying that all you have to do is to confess something with your mouth and be saved. Which, if you're just pulling a verse out of the Bible, and that's what a lot do, you can teach that way. If you're trying to read it honestly, it's going to actually be somewhat maddening. Because you're reading through, and Paul is saying something else, and then he says this, basically. And it's the interpreter taking something, this leads to this leads to this, and it's a broader point, and he makes it simpler. It's like, this gives you this. Well, yes, but there's more to it than just this thing, It's very subtle. It's not directly wrong, and other translations have gone even further down this path, but it definitely can lead you to some wrong conclusions.
Well, the King James is saying unto, toward,
yeah.
in the direction of. Not there yet, but getting that way. And this other one says you've done there.
That you've gotten it, yeah. And there are other examples, especially, there are other examples that carry forward like that. Now, ironically, I do like its rendering of 2 Timothy 3:16 better, when it says, all Scripture is God-breathed. That's actually more literal, but they did it for their own reasons. Another example, and there's more than this, Psalm 51:5. Again, Calvinism big time here, and it's a heavy Calvinist biasis. This is going to be with original sin. The psalmist in the King James, behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Now, Psalm 51, famous psalm, traditionally penned by David after his confrontation by Nathan and being caught in the sin with Bathsheba and all that. He is despondent. He is going to God. He's praying on behalf of the child who will pass. He's broken. In this we have created me a clean heart, O God. Renew a steadfast spirit within me. Powerful stuff. This verse is kind of ripped out of its context, along with Romans 5 ripped out of its context. And he uses proof texts that for original sin, that people are born in sin, that false teaching. And it's because David is being hyperbolic. He's using very poetic language. Poems are like that. Psalms are like that. Be careful about making huge doctrinal positions from the Psalms. But what does the NIV and some translators go with? Surely I was sinful at birth. Okay, you could take that as hyperbole, I guess. Sinful from the time my mother conceived me. But it's taking a much more direct form of I was born in sin. I was sinful when I was born. And I've been continued to be sinful from that very point, from the point of conception. When really, he's talking about how terrible he is. I've never been good. He's, again, hyperbole. There's another psalm when he'll say, I have been faithful since birth. They don't go to that one very often. I have been good since birth. He is, yeah. He's on it. But this is taking that and just making it very thought for thought as opposed to word for word. Well, we know what he means, we've decided. So his thought is this. We're going to express it as this thought. I'm born in sin. Okay. Yeah. And this is actually, some versions go further. This is when it was starting to take that, when you start to take liberties moving from words to ideas, it really opens the door to do pretty much whatever you want. This was kind of the test on that. They don't go super far in certain areas, and depending on some of the books are fine. It's just right at that edge.
Depends upon who's the customer. The Bible publishing companies are in business to make money, and they want to sell as many Bibles as they can.
That is true.
And they're going to translate according to what the customers want.
Or for their own particular needs. That's why the New World Translation from the Jehovah's Witnesses is very specific in certain areas. Yeah. Well, not to be overly cynical, but that's always been true. The King James was full of religious politics, which is why Jacob, the apostle or half-brother of Jesus, and Jacob, the brother of John, had their names renamed to James. And we know them as James. In the New Testament, they're Jacob. But James is the anglicized form of Jacob. And they're Jacob. It's John and Jacob, the sons of Zebedee. Jacob, the half-brother of Christ. But how better way to venerate the king than to make them James? So, I mean, things stick. Little things stick. All right. New King James. I'm not going to give it. The New King James is a tough one to really kind of do the strengths and weaknesses with, because in terms of a version, it's really just an attempt to modernize something that already was. It is a revision. And there have been other forms of this out there. One that's floating around I've seen on eSword and things is the modern King James version. And the difference between it and the New King James version is it's public domain. But what will happen is a number of people come along, they'll latch on to the public domain versions. The King James is a great target. And then they'll put their own little form on it, and then they can sell it. The New King James was a very popular way of trying to do this in 1982. The idea was to replace the King James Version. And the drive for this came from several different sectors. The Anglican Church had already moved on to some of their own very specific British versions that were built upon the English Revised. There was the ASV and different stuff. And I didn't want to go down that thread too far. But they might use something like this in an English equivalent or British equivalent. But this was the American form. Now, some of our brethren that are King James only will allow the New King James, which is curious to me. But really, because the New King James translators made an active choice to stay as close as they could in verbiage to the King James, it's not a version, it's a revision. You have the specter of the King James in view. Now you might say, well, isn't that true of the New American Standard? No, they didn't use the ASV at all as a basis. They just took the name for whatever reason. They went direct. This has the King James phrasing. It's the way it presents itself in mind as it's being translated. So it's just a new arrangement. Now, weirdly enough, and this is something they actually improved on the King James, of the modern versions especially, it's really a good translation if you're trying to do a word study. And what I mean is, a lot of the translators, you'll have an original term in Greek or Hebrew. They'll find an English equivalent that fits the context. But sometimes they'll use 2 or 3 different words in different ways. It's kind of frustrating when you're trying to see all the usage of it. A word study is basically where you take something like, say, Philippians, and you just try to find, okay, Paul's going to use this word. Let's find every usage of that word in the book. Boom, 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 boom. There's one that's unity is one that's pretty useful. Phronane, same mind, unified. It's in the New American Standard, it'll show up with like 3 or 4 different terms. And it gets lost sometimes because it's not unity every time. Be unified, have the same mind, same purpose. All those, it's same term. It's actually kind of the locus of his letter. The New King James is pretty good, not perfect about, they'll pick a word and they'll stick with it. So if you look up that term, it'll be more consistent for word studies. We discovered this kind of, doing our thing at school. I don't know why. We couldn't really figure out why. They're just pretty good about it, and a lot of the other versions are not. And you're like, okay. But, for a word study Bible, it actually is pretty useful that way. Yeah, it's pretty consistent. And the consistency is helpful, because sometimes meaning can be lost. Weaknesses, basically, it's by design directly connected to the King James. So it suffers from what is now lacking about the King James. Now, if you remember the King James, the translators did their job. You had the 3 companies of 6 men in the different places, or 53 men, the 3 places, the 6 companies of 53 men. They did the different things. And they made a pretty good effort, and they were well funded, and they did good work for what they had in 1611. But on their cover page, the preface, what did they say? Is this the end-all to end-all? No. When you find better manuscripts, update this. And they did. It was updated in 1612. Had to be. It was updated in 1613. It was updated in like 1618. The last version we have comes from 1762. It's been updated many times until it was finally just abandoned and became truly public domain. The New King James, in 1982, had the benefit of 350, 60, 70 plus more years of textual evidence. But if it had to follow the King James path, it ignored the others. It stuck with the King James basis because it needed to be tied to it. If something had been discovered that, this is a much better form, this is a better rendering, it went, nope, we need to stick with this, which went against what the translators of the King James originally would have wanted. It kept the verses that didn't belong. It kept a lot of the phrasing. It doesn't say Easter, at least, but it makes it a weakness in terms of how accurate it is. And it's not trying to beat up on the versions. They took a very they took an active choice to follow the old path, ignoring anything that was new, better information. So. But if you're used to the King James, it can be very familiar while still being conversational, and it can be very useful to someone who has done a lot of memorization in the King James. It can help. So, any other thoughts on that one?
So how much influence did King James have on the translators in terms of restricting them in certain areas in terms of how they would handle the process?
We don't.
I've read that there was, in some areas, there were some specific demands made by him that they were restricted to follow.
I have read that as well. It's hard to know for certain exactly how hands-on he was, but he did have particular concerns. Now, if we remember, he was bringing this about as kind of a goodwill gesture to try to calm some of the religious tension that had been going on between Catholicism and Anglicanism, but he still was going to defer to what the Anglicans wanted. Famously, baptism is one of those things, creating this new made-up word because he wasn't immersed, he was sprinkled. He influenced, as best we can tell, certain areas, especially ones dealing with authority. Not that he had to do much, really. Romans 13, respect the authorities. How hands-on he was is debated, because we don't really have records that say definitively one way or another. We do know that he kind of had pushed on certain areas, but in terms of the literary scholarship stuff, I'm going to assume he deferred to a lot of their expertise, because it frankly probably would have bored him, the nitty, the deep down details. But he had certain things that he wanted to be known, and the fact that they changed Jacob to James, and that certain choices were made in a couple places. The usage of Easter actually is suggested to be one of them, as opposed to the Passover. Passover was, this is going to sound weird, considered overly Jewish, because it is, but the influences of the time didn't want that in there. There was influence. It just, we don't know how much.
We were always, I guess I was taught that it was more assumed by the translators, not so much dictated by King James himself.
Felt pressure.
That's the thing. How do you know? All he has to do is send like an envoy to them to kind of do the thing, and then his hands are clean. So I've heard it both ways, that he was like lording over, and I've heard that he didn't really care. I kind of lean probably more toward the latter, that it was just a vessel for him to solidify control, because he was the de facto head of that church that Henry had created. And the Bishop of Canterbury has the authority, but it's vested with the king. So it was a means to consolidate. He had just taken the throne of England after being the King of Scotland and unified those together. Scotland was heavily Presbyterian, which was Protestant, whereas England had been back and forth between Anglicanism and Catholicism. He wanted to join those Protestant factions together and solidify control. And yeah, politics, truth takes kind of a back burner. But you had a lot of honest men scholars trying to at least get the information out. Those that had predecessors that were literally put to death for doing what they were doing. And here's the thing, once you get on that committee, you're doing your work, James has a heart attack, and another heir comes in and decides to murder you. It can happen. Yeah? Your name's now associated with this thing. So it's a very, very scary time. They always are, right? Okay, the English Standard. The English Standard was originally published in 2001. You could get it in one type and in black or black. They eventually came out with a thin line that was also in black. But Crossway was the group behind it. They really wanted this out there. It was translated using formal equivalents, which had been less popular. For a long time there, you had that kind of ride in the 80s and 90s where, especially with evangelical movements, were getting a lot of growth in certain areas. There was a lot of emotion-driven church functions, and they wanted these very flowery, very emotional translations, and a whole bunch of them blossomed. And we weren't seeing any that were from the, quote, conservative, the formal equivalence line until the English Standard. But there were people so used to all these new translations that saw, oh, this was published when? 2001? It must be bad. Because if it's new, it's bad. Because they were so used to being disappointed. However, they were trying to fit that. It originally came with a complimentary CD-ROM. Now today we're like, oh, this was like a big deal in 2001. It was underneath the lid of the box. Many of them got thrown away because people didn't notice it was in there. Came with a free version of some software that contained the English Standard with it. I ended up getting the paid version of that software because I used it for some certain stuff. But it was a risk, really, at a time when the internet was more of a Wild West and piracy was real easy. It hasn't really changed, but it's a different form. There was a risk to basically give their publication away in that form because there's nothing stopping you from copying that CD-ROM and giving it to someone else. They didn't seem as interested in licensing. They're a lot cooler about using their version than the New American Standard and Lockman is. It's been included in a lot of the free stuff that's out there. Strengths. It maintains a good balance between being a literal translation while using conversational English. It did a pretty good job of taking the English from Aliens in the New American Standard and balancing the conversational English of like an NIV and finding a good middle ground for it. Not quite as literal as the New American Standard on the scale, but an improvement over the New International's thought-by-thought process. Going back to word for word by word, trying to be communicative. And a good conversational version. It also benefited from the most up-to-date textual information of the time in 2001. And yes, they were still finding stuff. We still are. Doesn't tend to be anything that's like world-changing, but still, we still find information. And what's helpful is archaeological data tends to give, digs and various things tend to give us a better shape of understanding how empires were formed and things. So that allows us to even add like extras, like better maps, better backgrounds, and better information to help explain terms like certain measurements and certain practices and certain terms that show up that were just translated before. We have more information about what they mean. And with footnotes, you have better explanations, so that's always helpful. Weaknesses. It does not use italics for words supplied by the translators. I'm betting they had a big fight over to do it or to not do it. I would imagine it was something that went back and forth. But so few Bibles, pretty much none of them after 1978, did. And if you're trying to appeal to a market that's on the side of the room with easier conversational versions, but trying to be a little more, quote, conservative, italics might confuse your audience. I don't know if that was their reasoning or what. But the supplied words are not italicized. Is that the end all to everything? No, it just bugs me. So maybe that's just my pet peeve. I don't know. There are a few times when removing the italicized words will give you a better rendering. And it's always a good practice to do. Read it with them supplied, read it without them supplied, and see if it still makes sense or if it changes the meaning. Because that's the translator trying to help you. It also does have some weird translations from time to time. In a couple places, the one that usually comes up a lot, I remember Wayne Jackson making quite a deal about this one, is in Malachi 2, where we just were at last week. The King James, "For the Lord, the God of Israel, saith that he hateth putting away. For one covereth violence with his garment, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed to your spirit, that ye deal not treacherously." And this is when he's telling them, actually, they need to put away their foreign wives. "For the man who does not love his wife, but divorces her, says the Lord, the God of Israel, covers his garment with violence, says the Lord of hosts. So guard yourself in your spirit and do not be faithless." So, hate, one rendering has God hating the practice of divorce. It takes it to a man who divorces his wife hates her, but takes God completely out of the equation, which isn't in the original Hebrew. God is saying he doesn't want this to happen. It really changes it a lot. And this was the most recent version that I took from my phone when I did it. I think they've actually updated this, because when I think it was first released, it said the man who hates and divorces, and that didn't make any sense whatsoever, so they smoothed it a bit. You'll run into things like this in every version. Sometimes you just have to think as to why it's rendered a particular way versus another way. I don't know. But like I said, there are some others out there. The NET, the New English translation that was going for the net.net Bible, it was trying to be the online Bible, like the one. No one really bit, but that's out there. The Modern King James is another one I mentioned. Like I said, I just saw yesterday the Legacy Standard Bible, which had a little website, but not a whole lot more information. So we'll see how that goes. Maybe check it out. The thing was, they had like 2 at Mardell, and they were genuine leather, like cowhide, and they were like 140, which, they didn't have any like little gift Bible versions to kind of look over, so I'm like, okay, we'll see. But John MacArthur approves. I found that interesting. And I tried to dig up a little bit more on it. It's real recent, last year or 2. They're still making them, and they're not all one direction or the other. And is that a good or a bad thing? It's great. It's a good thing. More the merrier. It can cause some confusion. But when we complain about translations, those are some, I'll borrow a phrase here, some first world problems we're really complaining about a lot of the time. Because aside from German, which has quite a few, given its history, most languages you're lucky if there are 5 versions, and in many you're lucky if there are 2, and in many you're lucky if there's even 1. There are no perfect translations, but God has done his very best to bring from what, he's done perfectly, to bring from what he inspired men down the line that we've been going all these weeks to us. And I'm not going to say to use X or Y. I would say use more than one. I'd say check them all. There are some bad ones, but there's no perfect ones. I don't think it was any, there's a whole lot more we could dig into, but I'm looking at the clock, and that gets down into some like textual basis type stuff, to where when I was talking about the eclectics text, you were already like, oh, whatever. So any thoughts, comments? Did I beat up anyone? Did I step on anyone's toes with their favorite version? I tried to beat them all up. That was kind of the plan.
That's what I said about the King James. We know the mistakes in the King James.
Yep.
And we've been taught where the problems are, so we can work through them. A lot of the newer ones we don't know. We've not been educated where the mistakes are. Work through those, and that's where the challenge is.
Certainly. And I don't know, fights over these things get kind of silly. Like I said, there are tomes out there, 700-800 pages long, written by preachers about why X version is the worst thing ever. Okay, that's great. I'm not reading that, because I've already read enough on those back when I did that for a thing. But it's not edifying at a certain point. You can have facts in various forms, but we have better things to do with our time, frankly. The basis at school that we use is kind of the what we went through chapter by chapter and so forth, like the textbook. That kind of is the basis of these 4 things, is a book by 2 men, Norman Geisler and William Nix. I gave it to Grover for A General Introduction to the Bible. If anyone wants the book reference, I have it here. And there's some others. Neil Lightfoot has a good little book on how we got the Bible. Jack P. Lewis had some interesting things. And I have some of these in my library. I don't know how easy they are to come by. I think Neil Lightfoot's you can get. And you can get Geisler and Nix, but yeah, if you want a textbook to dig into these things. Trying to give every possible thing as we wrap, so speak now or ask me afterward.
Is there an online list we can go to get a copy of that bibliography?
I could, or it's only 5 of them here, and I printed this. I could just hand it to you if you want it, because I was going to throw it away. Because I can just print another one. Yeah, it's not exhaustive. I have a longer one in one of my reports somewhere, but those are the 5 primary book sources that are useful. Dan Owens on there isn't easy to come by, though. That's been out of print for a long time. So. Okay. Is there anyone that needs to partake of the Lord's Supper this evening? Okay. Is there anything else we want to mention before this close? Okay. Well, remember, there's the meal again on Wednesday. We missed out on the last one because I was down in Austin, but it's back at 5:30, so remember that in class. Men's breakfast is coming up on this Saturday. Okay, sounds good. All right, well, if we're done, just bow with me and we'll go to our Father in prayer. Father, we thank you for this time we've had to gather, to reflect, to study, to converse, to consider your word. Lord, we just pray that we have hearts that are open to trying to seek what you would have us to know, that much like anything else in this life, there are many things that we can become attached to that are common to us, that are so-called common knowledge or things that we know. Let us always see what you would have us to see, no matter what. Help us to always look to you, to not be satisfied with what we know, but to seek you and to study. We thank you for giving your word. We thank you for giving us knowledge that's in it, but also your Son that accomplished so much and what it records and gives us purpose and meaning. Help it not to be just thoughts on a page, words on a page, ideas. Help it to be something that will be a part of our life and that we seek to emulate however best we can, as imperfect as we are. We thank you for your Son. We thank you for his example. We thank you for his sacrifice. We thank you for loving and speaking to us. Be with us this week. And it's in his name that we pray.